Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. The first day without a letter, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was too busy, or something had come up. The second day, I was still calm, still rational. By the third day, I started to worry. By the fifth day, panic set in. I called his commanding officer, but they assured me that everything was fine. He's probably just tied up with duties, they said. But I knew something was wrong. The silence was deafening. The empty mailbox felt like a physical weight, pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. What had happened? Where was he? Looking back, it's hard to believe that the person telling you this story is me. I was just an ordinary woman, living a simple life with a man I loved, Liam. We had a perfect little world, filled with laughter, plans, and love. I never imagined that one phone call would change everything. He was everything to me. His touch, his smile, the way he made me laugh even when I was upset. Our love seemed unbreakable. We talked about a future that would be filled with happiness. We even made plans to buy a house, get married, and raise a family. But life, it seems, has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. And so, one day that phone call came. His unit was called up for deployment. He was going to Afghanistan. I remember the fear that washed over me when he told me. I remember the lump in my throat as I tried to hide my tears, even though he could see right through me. But I tried to be strong. For him, for us. I convinced myself that everything would be fine. But the truth was, I had no idea what was ahead. This is where our story begins, before everything changed, before the pain, the longing, and the uncertainty of whether or not he'd come back to me. Liam was everything I could have ever hoped for in a partner. He was kind, strong, loving, and ambitious. We had dreams together, big dreams, and I thought nothing could tear us apart. But, of course, life isn't always that simple. His enlistment was always in the back of my mind, but it wasn't something I ever truly feared. He loved what he did, and I respected that. Still, the night he told me about his deployment, I felt the earth shift beneath my feet. This was real. He was going, and there was nothing I could do about it. The night before he left, we held each other like it was the last time we would ever be together. We promised each other that we would write every day. I told him I'd wait for him to come back to me. I didn't know then how much I would have to fight to keep that promise. I had no idea what I was about to go through. The next day, he left, and I was left standing in an empty house, holding on to the memory of his smile and the hope that he would come back. The days that followed were a blur. I filled my time with work and friends, but it was hard not to feel the absence of the man who had once been my everything. He was across the world, and all I had was the promise of letters. The first letter came 2 days after he left, and I still remember how I felt holding it in my hands. The familiar handwriting on the front, the smell of his cologne faintly lingering on the paper. I opened it quickly, eager to hear from him. He wrote about the things he was doing, his comrades, and the conditions they were facing in Afghanistan. There was something comforting in his words. He assured me he was safe, that everything was fine. It was the first of many letters that would come over the next few months. Each letter felt like a lifeline, proof that he was still there, still thinking of me. His words brought me peace, even in the most difficult moments. He told me about his daily routine, how the days dragged on and how he missed me more than I could imagine. I missed him too, but the letters were a small comfort in an ocean of worry. They were the thread that connected us when the distance seemed too vast. With each letter, I felt his presence, even though he was half a world away. We promised to write every day, and we kept that promise. Each letter was a new piece of our lives that we shared with each other, and I clung to those words like a lifeline. At first, everything seemed normal. His letters came regularly, and life felt bearable. But then, over time, something started to shift. The letters changed. The warm, loving tone of his early letters faded, replaced by a more detached, almost formal style. He no longer shared the little details of his day-to-day life, the things that once brought him joy or made him laugh. Instead, his letters focused on the hardships of his deployment. He wrote about the long hours, the brutal heat, and the constant pressure. And with each letter, I felt myself growing more distant from him. I tried not to overthink it. After all, war changes people. But still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Where had the man I had married gone? The man who used to talk about our future, our plans? His letters no longer gave me comfort, they gave me fear. And the silence between them only added to the weight in my chest. I tried to reassure myself. He was just stressed. Maybe he was too busy to write as often. But in my heart, I knew something was off. I just didn't know what to do about it. The silence was growing louder, and the fear of losing him seemed to be creeping in. The first day without a letter, I tried to remain calm. He was busy, I told myself. The second day, I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. But by the third day, I couldn't shake the growing sense of panic. The silence felt like a void, swallowing everything I knew about our relationship. The letters had been my lifeline, and without them, I felt adrift. I called his commanding officer, but they assured me everything was fine. He's just busy with his duties, they said. But something in my gut told me it was more than that. Days turned into weeks, and still, no word from Liam. I tried to stay strong, tried to trust that everything would be okay. But I couldn't ignore the sense of dread building inside me. I was losing him, and I didn't even know why. I couldn't understand why he had stopped writing. Where was he? Was he okay? The questions filled my mind, and with every passing day, the fear became harder to bear. The silence was deafening, and the emptiness in my heart felt like it might swallow me whole. The waiting was the hardest part. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of not knowing. Each day that passed without a letter made me more desperate for any kind of news. I had already called the military several times, but they couldn't give me anything. He's fine. We haven't heard of any incidents involving his unit, they said. Their words meant to reassure, but they only deepened my fear. I could tell they weren't telling me everything. They couldn't, or maybe they just didn't know. But I was his wife. I knew him, and something was terribly wrong. His absence was eating away at me. Every minute that ticked by felt like an eternity. What could have happened? Was he hurt? Was he in danger? Why wasn't he writing? The silence was unbearable. It became a physical ache in my chest that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think about anything other than him. I kept imagining the worst-case scenarios. Every time a knock on the door made my heart skip. What if something had happened to him? What if he had been captured, injured, or worse? Every night, I cried myself to sleep, clutching the empty space where his letters used to be. And every morning, I woke up hoping today would be the day I would hear from him. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the knock came. I had just gotten home from work and was in the middle of making dinner when I heard it. Slow, deliberate knocks on the door. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a neighbor or someone looking to sell something. But when I opened the door, I saw two uniformed soldiers standing there, their faces grim. My heart dropped into my stomach. The air around me seemed to grow still, like time itself was holding its breath. I froze. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you about your husband, Liam." They didn't have to say anything more. I knew. The words were already written on their faces, and suddenly, the world felt like it was collapsing around me. I didn't hear anything they said after that. I just heard the word missing echoing in my mind, over and over. The words were a heavy weight in my chest, pushing the air from my lungs. My body went numb as the room spun around me. Liam was missing. How could this be real? How could this be happening? How could he be gone? My heart shattered, and all I could do was stare at the soldiers in disbelief, the sound of their voices barely registering in my mind. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Captured. That's what they said. Liam, my brave, strong, fearless husband, had been taken. He wasn't missing. He had been captured by enemy forces. I could hardly breathe. The shock was so overwhelming that my mind struggled to process what they were telling me. They explained the details as best as they could, but I barely heard them. All I could think about was Liam, alone, trapped, far away. What was happening to him? Was he okay? The soldiers told me there would be a lot of paperwork, and they would do everything they could to find him, but all I could think about was the fact that he was no longer just on a deployment. He was in enemy hands. I didn't know what to do. The weight of the news crushed me, and I felt a deep, terrifying emptiness in my chest. It felt like the world was closing in on me. The house that once felt like home now felt empty, hollow, and cold. I couldn't stop shaking. The tears came, then, in waves. I tried to pull myself together, but it felt impossible. I couldn't even process the pain. All I could do was hope, pray that they would find him, that he would return to me. Days turned into weeks, then into months. I didn't know how to keep going. I kept hoping for a miracle, kept waiting for the phone call or the letter that would bring him back. But it didn't come. The waiting became unbearable. The uncertainty gnawed at me, every moment consumed by fear. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus on anything other than him. I kept praying, whispering words to a God I wasn't sure I still believed in, hoping for some sign that he was alive, that he was safe. I would spend hours sitting by the window, staring out at the street, waiting for something, anything, that would tell me Liam was coming home. But nothing came. The silence felt like a weight on my soul, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. I clung to the hope that he was still out there, that one day he would return to me. But every day that passed without news made it harder to hold on to that hope. Every day, the pain in my heart grew heavier. I felt like I was drowning in it, but I couldn't give up. I had to believe that he was still alive, that one day, I would hear from him again. The agony of not knowing if Liam was alive or gone was a kind of torture I wouldn't wish on anyone. The days blurred together, each one feeling like the last. I would wake up with a jolt, hoping that maybe today would be the day the military would call with news. But day after day, there was nothing. I tried to go about my daily routine, tried to keep up appearances, but it was impossible. Every moment felt heavy, every conversation strained. I couldn't concentrate on anything. My mind was always with him, wondering where he was, what he was going through. Was he cold? Was he scared? Was he thinking of me? The not knowing was the worst part. It was like being stuck in a nightmare, unable to wake up. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop the tears. And even though I had so many people around me, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Everyone would tell me to be strong, to hold on to hope, but it felt like they didn't understand. They couldn't understand the depth of the pain, the constant ache in my chest. It was a pain that never went away. And each day, as the uncertainty stretched on, it seemed to grow worse. The passage of time doesn't make the pain easier. If anything, it deepens it, like a wound that never fully heals. As the months passed without any news of Liam, the people around me began to encourage me to move on. They thought I was clinging to a fantasy. You have to let go, they said, not understanding that letting go of Liam meant letting go of everything I knew about myself. I couldn't just erase the love I felt for him, the years we'd spent together, the dreams we had. My heart refused to accept that he was gone, and no amount of advice from well-meaning friends and family could change that. I wasn't ready to give up on him. Not yet. I continued to hope, even as the silence dragged on. Hope became my only companion, my one source of strength. But hope also made me feel like I was walking in circles, trapped in a never-ending cycle of waiting. I would spend my nights sitting by the window, staring out at the stars, whispering his name into the darkness, praying that somehow he could hear me, that somehow he could come back. I wasn't ready to give up on him. I couldn't be. If I lost hope, then I lost everything. And so, every day, I fought the voices of doubt that filled my mind. I told myself that Liam would come back. I held on to that belief with everything I had. I had to. It came out of nowhere, an unexpected phone call. I had long stopped expecting anything, had almost resigned myself to the silence. But when the phone rang, I didn't hesitate. I picked it up, almost afraid to answer, afraid it would be another cruel reminder of how nothing had changed. But it wasn't. It was the military. "Ma'am," the voice on the other end said, "we have some news about your husband." My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't breathe. "We've located him. He's alive." The words hit me like a tidal wave. Alive. My Liam was alive. The weight of the news felt like it was lifting off my chest, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. I could hardly process the information. He was alive. He had been found. I asked a million questions, but they couldn't give me all the answers yet. They told me he was safe for now, and they were working on getting him home. But just knowing that he was alive, after everything, after all the fear, the doubt, and the pain, was enough. It was the miracle I had been praying for. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what came next, I would find a way to get through it. Because he was coming home. When they finally brought Liam home, he was nothing like the man I had sent off to war. The man who had walked out of our front door with a smile, with excitement about the future, was now a shadow of himself. His eyes were empty, distant, and when he saw me, there was no recognition, no warmth. I wanted to run to him, to hold him, but something inside me hesitated. Something had changed, and it wasn't just the physical toll of the war. There was something darker in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't the same man who had promised me forever. It wasn't just the fact that he was now in a wheelchair, missing his legs. It was the way he held himself, the way his eyes avoided mine. He seemed lost, like the man I loved had disappeared somewhere in the chaos of his captivity. The reunion I had imagined in my head, full of joy, full of tears of relief, never came. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence, a tension I couldn't understand. I wanted to reach out to him, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if he wanted me to. And in that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. My husband had come back to me, but he was a different person. The war had taken more from him than just his legs. It had taken his soul. I stood there, in the doorway of the room where Liam was being kept, my heart heavy with anticipation. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. How he would rush into my arms, how we would cry and laugh, how everything would be okay. But when I saw him, sitting there in that wheelchair, his face turned away from me, I knew nothing would ever be the same. He didn't look at me. He didn't even seem to know I was there. His eyes were fixed on something far away, as if he couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge my presence. The distance between us was palpable, like an invisible wall had been built around him. My throat tightened, and I fought the urge to cry. He was right there, but it felt like I was losing him all over again. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, to let him know I was here, that I hadn't gone anywhere. But the words caught in my throat. It was like he was a stranger. This wasn't the man I had married. Where was the Liam I knew? The Liam who smiled at me and made me feel safe. What had happened to him? The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until finally, he spoke. But his voice was flat, distant. "I'm not the man you married," he said, his words cutting through me like a knife. And in that moment, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about missing his legs. This was about missing the man he used to be. The first time I saw Liam in that wheelchair, it hit me like a punch to the gut. The reality of what had happened to him, of what the war had done, was right in front of me. His legs were gone. The strong, capable man I had once known, who used to carry me in his arms, who ran with me through the park, who laughed at the smallest things, was now unable to even stand. He was completely dependent on others, something I knew he had never wanted. But it wasn't just the loss of his legs that haunted him. It was the way he carried himself, as though everything he had once been had been stripped away. His eyes were haunted, distant, as though he was somewhere far, far away. He didn't seem to recognize me. Not really. He knew who I was, of course, but he didn't see me. He didn't smile at me the way he used to. He didn't reach for me. There was a darkness inside of him now, and I didn't know how to get through to him. I wanted to hold him, to tell him that I still loved him, but he was pushing me away. Every time I tried to get close, he flinched. And the worst part was that I didn't know how to help him. I didn't know how to fix this. All I could do was be there. But even that didn't seem enough. When I looked at Liam in that wheelchair, it felt like the entire world had shifted beneath me. The man I had sent to war was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. It wasn't just the absence of his legs that tore at my heart. It was the emptiness in his eyes, the way he seemed to have withdrawn into himself. He was no longer the man who would reassure me when I was scared, or who would laugh at my silly jokes. He was a stranger now, broken, and I didn't know how to reach him. I could see the pain in every line of his face, but it was a silent pain, one he refused to speak about. His legs were gone, but so much more had been taken from him. I had heard stories of soldiers coming back changed, but I never imagined it would be this way. I had always thought that when he came home, things would return to normal, that we would pick up where we left off. But the man who returned was not the same one I had married. He had been through unimaginable things, things I couldn't even begin to comprehend, and I wasn't sure how to help him through it. He didn't want my help, though. He refused to open up, to let me in. The pain of watching him retreat into himself was unbearable. I had to remind myself that he was still the man I had fallen in love with, but it felt like we were drifting further apart with every passing day. How could I make him see that I didn't care about his legs, that I loved him, all of him? In the silence of our home, I found myself aching for the life we once had. The laughter, the shared moments, the plans we had made for the future, they all seemed so distant now. Liam had always been my rock, my strength. But now, I was the one trying to hold everything together while he seemed to fall apart. I didn't care about the wheelchair. I didn't care about the prosthetics or the scars. I cared about him, the man I had married, the man I had loved with everything in me. But despite my love, he pushed me away, and I didn't know why. He would barely look at me, and when he did, it was with such a coldness in his eyes that it felt like a slap in the face. I wanted to tell him that I didn't care what had happened to him, that I would love him no matter what. But the words got stuck in my throat. I was scared. Scared that he wouldn't believe me. Scared that he would push me away even more. So, I stayed silent. I let him withdraw into himself, hoping that somehow, one day, he would realize that I was still here, that I hadn't gone anywhere. I still loved him, but he couldn't see that. He couldn't see past his own pain. And so, we existed in this limbo, where love still burned between us, but neither of us could reach out to touch it. That was the moment I knew the war had taken more than just his legs. Liam had always been the most confident, the most strong-willed man I knew. He had always been the one to reassure me, to make me feel safe. But now, the man I had once known was gone. When he whispered those words to me, I felt my heart shatter into a million pieces. I wanted to tell him that it didn't matter, that I loved him no matter what. But the truth was, I wasn't sure he believed that anymore. How could he? He had been through something I could never understand, something that had broken him in ways I couldn't fix. "I'm not the man you married," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to tell him that I didn't care, that the man I loved was still inside of him. But I knew he couldn't hear me. He had built walls around himself so high that nothing could get through, and I couldn't make him tear them down. So, I stayed quiet. I stayed by his side, hoping that somehow, he would see that I was still here, still waiting for him. But in that moment, I knew we had a long road ahead of us, and I wasn't sure if we could make it. Because if Liam didn't believe in the love we shared, then what was left for us? I watched as Liam struggled to adjust to his new life. But no matter what I did, he refused to let me in. He refused to let anyone in. He was drowning in his own pain, and there was nothing I could do to save him. Every time I reached out to him, he pulled away. Every time I tried to talk to him, he shut me down. He refused to acknowledge the love I had for him, the love that had never wavered. He had become a shell of the man I had once known, and it hurt more than I could ever explain. I wanted to help him. I wanted to make him see that he was still the man I loved, that he was still important, still worth something. But all my efforts felt in vain. He would retreat further into himself, pushing me away like I was the enemy. The nights were the hardest. He would sit in silence, his eyes vacant, his body stiff, refusing to even acknowledge that I was in the room. It was like I was invisible to him. And the more he withdrew, the more I tried to reach him. I tried to talk to him, tried to show him that he didn't have to carry this burden alone, but it was like talking to a wall. His pain had consumed him, and I didn't know how to get through to him. It was so hard, watching him suffer in silence, feeling helpless. But I couldn't give up. I couldn't give up on him, not when he needed me the most. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope, trying to keep my balance while everything around me seemed to be falling apart. Our love, once so strong and unshakable, now felt fragile, like a thread ready to snap at any moment. Liam's pain was suffocating, and I felt it too. Every time he pushed me away, every time he closed himself off from me, it was like I was losing him all over again. I couldn't reach him, no matter how hard I tried. And the more he pushed me away, the more I clung to him, hoping that somehow I could pull him back to me. But the harder I tried, the more distant he became. The man I had loved, the man who had once been my everything, was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. I was afraid. Afraid that if I kept trying, I would only push him further away. Afraid that one day he would stop loving me, that he would stop seeing me. And yet, despite the fear, despite the fragility of everything we had, I couldn't give up on him. I couldn't give up on us. Our love might have felt fragile, but I knew that as long as I had breath in my body, I would fight for it. I would fight for him. And maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Each day felt like a battle, and the hardest fight was with Liam himself. I could see the pain, the guilt, the frustration in his eyes, but he refused to see that he still had so much to offer. He had given up on himself long before I even realized it. He no longer believed in the man he used to be, the man who had dreams and ambitions, the man who would smile with pride when he spoke about our future together. I fought so hard to remind him of that man, but every time I tried, I met a wall. He wasn't ready to listen, to believe that he could still be that man. I wanted to hold him, to tell him that we could still have a future, that we could still build something beautiful together. But he wouldn't let me in. The words he spoke were so full of defeat. It broke me. I fought for him in every way I knew how, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't make him believe in himself when he no longer wanted to. He was trapped in his own mind, trapped in the belief that he was broken, that he wasn't worthy of love. And no matter how much I tried to convince him otherwise, he couldn't hear me. His scars were more than just physical. They ran deep into his soul, and he was so consumed by them that he couldn't see that he was still the man I loved. It was a painful reality to face. I had to let him find his way. But that didn't mean I would stop fighting for him. I would never stop loving him, even if it felt like the fight was in vain. I could hear him in the dark, his breathing shallow, restless. The nights were always the hardest. During the day, he could distract himself with television or the few tasks he managed to complete. But at night, when the world grew quiet and the darkness settled in, the pain would consume him. He would lie there in bed, staring at the ceiling, lost in his thoughts, and I would lie beside him, reaching out with my heart, hoping that somehow he could feel my presence, feel my love. But the man I was holding on to seemed so far away. He barely spoke anymore. The silence between us grew thick, suffocating. I missed the sound of his voice, the way he would share his thoughts, his dreams. Now, there was only silence. Sometimes I would reach for his hand, but he would pull away, retreating into himself even further. It felt like he was slipping further from me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I had to watch him suffer in silence, watch as the nightmares from the war haunted him every night. The nightmares where he couldn't escape, where he was trapped in the violence, in the chaos. I knew he wasn't sleeping, that he was fighting battles in his mind that I couldn't see. And I couldn't help him. It was agony, lying there beside him, wanting so desperately to make him feel safe, but knowing that the man I loved was trapped inside his own prison. There were nights when I would cry silently in the dark, wishing I could take his pain away. But I knew he had to fight his own demons. All I could do was be there, as close as I could be, and hope that one day he would let me in again. I remember the first time he flinched when I touched him. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it sent a shock through my body. I didn't know what to do. The intimacy we had shared before, the way we could touch and communicate with nothing more than a glance, was gone. Now, even the simplest touch seemed to cause him pain. It was as if my love, the love that had once been a source of comfort, had become something that reminded him of his suffering. His body was still healing, and I knew that the physical scars were only a fraction of what he was dealing with inside. But I never expected this. I never expected him to flinch from me. I couldn't help but wonder if it was me he was recoiling from, or if it was the pain, the fear of being touched that reminded him of everything he had lost. He had always been so strong, so sure of himself, and now he was a shadow of that man. I tried not to take it personally, tried to remind myself that this wasn't about me. But every time he pulled away, it felt like a rejection. It hurt in a way I couldn't describe, and I knew that love was no longer enough to heal the wounds he carried. I couldn't fix him, I couldn't erase his pain, but I wanted so desperately to hold him close, to remind him that I was still here, still loving him with all my heart. But instead, I had to hold back. I had to wait and let him decide when he was ready to let me in again. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. There were days when I could see a flicker of the man I married, when I could almost reach him through the haze of his grief. Those were the days I clung to, the days when he would smile, however faintly, or when he would say something that reminded me of the man he used to be. But those moments were fleeting, and they made the darkness in between all the more painful. I could feel him slipping away, and I had to fight with everything I had to remind him of who he was. He wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a man who had been broken by war. He was Liam. He was the man I had fallen in love with. I knew that deep down, he still had the strength to fight this battle, to overcome his pain. But he didn't believe it. He didn't see that the man he had become was still worthy of love, still worthy of happiness. And I had to remind him of that. I had to remind him of who he was before the war, the man who loved to laugh, who dreamed of a future with me. I had to remind him that I didn't care about the things that had changed. What mattered was that he was still here, still with me. It wasn't easy. There were days when he would shut me out completely, when he would retreat so far into himself that I thought I was losing him forever. But I never gave up. I couldn't, because I knew, deep down, that he was still the man I had loved. And I would fight to remind him of that, no matter how long it took. Little by little, I began to see small changes. It wasn't much, just a word here, a glance there, but it was enough to make my heart hope again. Slowly, Liam started to let me in. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It wasn't an instant healing. But after so many days of silence, of pain, there were moments when he would reach out, when he would allow me to touch him without flinching. It was like the first crack in the dam, a small but significant sign that he was starting to believe in us again. But the road ahead was still long. He wasn't ready to talk about his pain yet, but there were days when he would open up, when he would share bits of what he was going through. I could see the shame in his eyes when he spoke about the things he had seen, the things he had done, but I never judged him. I knew he was struggling with so much more than just his injuries. I could see the guilt, the feeling of being broken, the fear that he would never be whole again. And it broke my heart. But I never stopped loving him. I never stopped fighting for him. And little by little, he started to believe that he wasn't broken, that he wasn't beyond saving. The road ahead was still long, and I knew it would take time. But I was willing to walk it with him every single step of the way. Every week, Liam and I would drive to the therapy clinic, and I could see the reluctance in his eyes. He never wanted to go, but he did. For me. For us. I knew how hard it was for him, how much he hated having to relive the pain and trauma of war, but I also knew it was necessary. The first few sessions were the hardest. He would sit there, barely speaking, looking as if the therapist's words went in one ear and out the other. He didn't want to open up. He didn't want to face the things he had done, the things he had seen. He just wanted to forget. But I could see a flicker of something in him each time. A small part of him still wanted to heal, still wanted to move forward. And that's why he kept going. Therapy wasn't easy. It wasn't a magic fix. It didn't erase the pain. But each time he showed up, each time he faced the demons from his past, it was a victory. And I celebrated it, even if it was a small one. I celebrated every inch of progress, every moment when he let his guard down, even if just a little. Slowly, he started to open up. He started to share, not everything, but pieces, bits of himself he had buried deep down. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But I saw the man I loved in those moments, in the vulnerability he allowed himself to show. Therapy was a battlefield for him, and I could see it. But every time he showed up, he was fighting. For himself. For me. For us. And I knew, deep down, that this was the start of his healing journey. Healing wasn't linear. Some days, Liam would seem like his old self, joking, laughing, holding my hand like he used to. And those days felt like magic. But then, there were the days when he would withdraw, when he would retreat into himself, and I felt like I was losing him again. I had learned not to take it personally, not to let his bad days tear me down. I had to remind myself that healing took time, but it wasn't easy. I wanted so badly to fix him, to take away the hurt and make everything better, but I couldn't. All I could do was show up, be there for him, and support him through the darkest days. And in those small victories, when he smiled, when he spoke about the future, when he allowed me to hold him close, I saw a glimmer of hope. Each victory, no matter how small, felt like a step forward, like I was reclaiming a piece of the man I loved. Those moments were precious, and I clung to them. Even when he seemed lost in the depths of his pain, I held on to those small victories. They were proof that he was still there, that he wasn't gone, that there was still hope. And with each small victory, I felt our love grow stronger. I knew that we could get through this, together. There were days when the weight of everything was too much for him to bear. Days when the memories of war would crash down on him like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him. I would watch him crumble, watch him fall apart right in front of me, and there was nothing I could do but hold him. He would break down, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with emotion. And all I could do was wrap my arms around him and tell him that it was okay to cry. It was okay to feel. I had learned that healing wasn't about being strong all the time. It wasn't about hiding your pain or pretending everything was okay. Healing was about allowing yourself to break, to fall apart, and then letting someone help you pick up the pieces. And that's what I did. I held him when he couldn't hold himself together. I was his rock, even when I didn't feel strong enough. I couldn't fix everything, but I could hold him through the worst of it. I could be there, a steady presence in the storm. And though I felt helpless at times, I knew that my love was the one thing that could help him piece himself back together. So, I held him. I held him through the tears, through the pain, through the hopelessness. And slowly, he began to let go of the weight he had been carrying for so long. Little by little, he was learning to trust me again, to lean on me when he couldn't carry the load himself. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and it was enough. There were moments when I felt like I was the only one holding us together. Liam was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained. There were days when he couldn't even get out of bed, when he felt so defeated that it seemed like nothing would ever get better. And in those moments, I had to step up. I had to be the strong one. I had to be his strength when he had none left. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I was drowning too, when I felt like I couldn't keep going, couldn't keep supporting him. But then I would look at him, see the sadness in his eyes, and I knew that I couldn't give up. I couldn't let him fall. I had to be there for him, even when I didn't have the energy to be strong. It wasn't just about holding him up, it was about helping him believe that he could stand again. And that was the hardest part. He didn't believe in himself anymore. He didn't believe that he could ever be the man he used to be. But I did. I knew he could heal. I knew that with time, with patience, and with love, he could find his way back. And so I kept going. I kept being strong for him, even when I didn't feel strong. Because I knew that if I didn't, we would both be lost. And I couldn't lose him. Not again. It happened so suddenly that I almost didn't believe it. Liam had been quiet all day, his usual brooding silence hanging over us like a dark cloud. But then, in the middle of a conversation, something shifted. I don't even remember what we were talking about. Probably something small, something trivial. But then he looked at me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. A real smile. Not a forced one. Not one full of pain or sadness. A genuine, heartfelt smile. And in that moment, my heart soared. It was like seeing the man I loved for the first time in months. I had missed that smile, the one that could light up a room, the one that made me feel safe and loved. I had wondered if it would ever come back, if I would ever see him smile like that again. And now, here it was. I couldn't contain the joy that bubbled up inside me. I wanted to cry, to laugh, to kiss him, all at once. This moment was everything. It wasn't a huge victory. It wasn't a miraculous turnaround, but it was a sign that he was still in there, that he was still fighting. And that was all I needed to keep going. The road ahead would still be long, still full of challenges. But in that moment, everything felt possible. And I knew that, no matter what, we would get through this together. It was a simple statement, but it hit me like a tidal wave. We were sitting in our living room, the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the window, casting a soft glow on everything. For the first time in so long, the atmosphere between us felt different. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't filled with the same tension that had been there for months. We had started to find our rhythm again, and in that moment, I knew things were beginning to heal. Liam looked at me, his eyes soft, and his lips curled into a smile. It was a smile I hadn't seen in so long, a smile that was full of love, of longing. And then, without warning, he whispered those words. I missed us. I couldn't hold back the tears. I hadn't realized how much I had missed hearing that, how much I had missed us. It felt like the world had paused, and everything around us became still. In that one sentence, Liam gave me the hope I had been clinging to. He hadn't just missed me, he had missed us. The life we had built, the connection we had shared before the war. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed that we could find our way back to that. I hugged him tightly, whispering my own words of reassurance. I missed us too, more than you can imagine. And in that moment, I knew we were on the path to healing, together. The transformation in Liam was gradual, but it was undeniable. For the longest time, he had seen himself as a broken man, someone defined by what the war had taken from him. He believed his scars, both physical and emotional, were all that remained of him. But slowly, through the therapy, through our late-night talks, and through the small victories we celebrated together, he began to see himself differently. One evening, we were sitting outside, watching the sunset, and Liam turned to me with a serious expression. I've been thinking, he said quietly, maybe I'm more than just the guy who came back from war. More than just the guy without legs. My heart skipped a beat. This was the first time I had ever heard him express any belief in his worth beyond the trauma he had endured. It was a monumental shift. You are, I replied, my voice steady but full of emotion. You're more than your wounds, Liam. You're the man I love. You're the man who fought for this country, who fought for us. And you're so much more than that. You're still you. You're still the man I married. The tears in his eyes said it all. It was like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, a burden he had been carrying for so long finally starting to ease. And in that moment, I realized that Liam was starting to believe it too. He was starting to believe that he was more than the sum of his scars, that he was still the man I had fallen in love with, and that the man he had become was just as worthy of love. It was the first real step toward him accepting his new reality without letting it define him completely. There's something transformative about love that is tested by hardship. It becomes something deeper, something more resilient. I could see it in the way Liam looked at me now. There was a quiet understanding between us, an unspoken connection that had been forged through our struggles. Our love had been through the fire, and it had come out stronger. Every conversation, every small victory, every moment of tenderness we shared was a thread weaving us closer together. It wasn't always perfect. There were still hard days, days when the past would come rushing back to him, when the trauma of war would resurface and threaten to pull him under. But in those moments, I was there, patient, steadfast, unwavering. And slowly, I began to see the man I had married return, not in the way I had expected, but in a way that was more beautiful than I could have imagined. He was different, yes, but in a way that was both painful and miraculous. Our love had been tested, but it had endured. And as we moved forward, I knew that our bond was stronger than ever before. It was like a tree with roots that ran deep. No matter how strong the storm, we would weather it together. And the love we shared would only grow, its foundation now unshakable. There's something magical about hearing the person you love laugh after a long time of silence. It's a sound that brings everything back to life, a sound that tells you that the person is truly there again. For so long, I hadn't heard Liam laugh. His sense of humor, his laughter, the way his eyes would light up when he found something funny, it had all been buried beneath the weight of his pain. But one evening, as we sat together, he made a joke, a silly one, something about the ridiculousness of the TV show we were watching. And for the first time in ages, I heard it. A real laugh. The kind of laugh that made my heart skip a beat. The kind of laugh that reminded me that the man I loved was still in there. I couldn't help but join in, my own laughter bubbling up with relief. I missed that sound, I said, my voice full of emotion. Liam smiled at me, the corners of his eyes crinkling in that familiar way. I missed making you laugh, he replied. And in that moment, I realized how far we had come. The man who had once been lost in his pain was now here, laughing with me, sharing moments of joy. It was a reminder that, no matter how hard things had been, there was still hope. There was still love. And we would continue to find those moments of light, even in the darkest of times. Liam had always been driven. Before the war, he had been full of ambition, full of dreams for the future. He had big plans, things he wanted to accomplish, places he wanted to go. But after everything, those dreams had seemed impossible. He couldn't imagine a life without his legs, without the man he thought he had been. But slowly, as he began to heal, I could see a spark return in his eyes. It started with small things, a new hobby here, a project there. He began to experiment with different activities, things he never thought he'd enjoy. It wasn't about replacing the life he had lost, but about finding a new way to live. One day, he picked up a paintbrush, and though his strokes were tentative at first, I could see the passion in his eyes as he created something beautiful. It wasn't just the art that mattered. It was the fact that he had found something that made him feel alive again. He started writing too, capturing his thoughts and emotions on paper in a way he never had before. And as he explored these new passions, I saw the man he had once been, but in a new form. He was creating again, dreaming again, and that, more than anything, was a sign that he was finding his way back to himself. He had a new purpose, one that didn't rely on the past but was built on the strength of everything he had overcome. And in that, I saw the future we could still have together. Healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's the small things, the quiet moments of connection, the tiny victories that accumulate over time, that really matter. Liam and I learned to celebrate those moments. Every day, we found something to be grateful for, something to acknowledge. It wasn't always easy, but we made it a point to appreciate the little things. The fact that Liam had gotten out of bed on his own that morning, that he had taken a step forward in therapy, that we had shared a laugh. We celebrated those victories like they were the most important things in the world, because, to us, they were. It wasn't about comparing ourselves to the past or measuring how far we still had to go. It was about acknowledging the progress we had made, no matter how small it seemed. One evening, after Liam had successfully completed a difficult therapy session, we sat together in the living room, hands clasped. "We did it," he said softly, his voice filled with pride. I smiled, my heart swelling with emotion. Yes, we did, and we'll keep doing it. It was a promise, a shared commitment to never stop fighting for each other, no matter what. Our love, just like our healing, wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, about showing up for one another day after day, and finding joy in even the smallest triumphs. There are moments in life that feel like pure magic, when the impossible becomes possible, when a dream you thought would never come true suddenly does. I had always dreamed of dancing with Liam, but after his injury, I never thought it would happen. He had told me before that dancing was something he would never be able to do again, and I had accepted that. But one evening, as we were sitting together in the living room, listening to our favorite song, something unexpected happened. Liam took my hand, his eyes meeting mine with a softness I hadn't seen in a long time. "Will you dance with me?" he asked, his voice tentative but full of hope. My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. His legs weren't the same, but I knew that his heart was still full of the love and joy that had always defined him. Without thinking, I stood up and placed my arms around him, pulling him gently toward me. It wasn't a traditional dance. It wasn't about fancy moves or perfect steps. It was about the connection we shared, the love that had survived the worst of storms. Liam held me close, and we swayed together in the most beautiful dance I had ever known. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter. The moment was everything. It was a symbol of everything we had been through and everything we had yet to overcome. And in that moment, I knew that love wasn't defined by what we had lost. It was defined by what we had found in each other. When Liam and I danced, it wasn't about movement, it was about spirit. His legs might have been gone, but his soul was still as vibrant, as full of life as it had ever been. It was as if, in that moment, the loss of his legs didn't matter at all. What mattered was the connection between us, the shared rhythm of our hearts. We moved together, not with our bodies but with our souls, in perfect harmony. There was a grace in that, a beauty that transcended anything I could have imagined. It was a dance of the heart, one that no injury could ever take away. Liam's eyes sparkled with a light that I hadn't seen in so long, and I could feel his love surrounding me. It wasn't about the physicality of dancing. It was about the emotion, the raw vulnerability, the trust that had been rebuilt over time. We had both been broken, but in that moment, we were whole. And as we danced, I realized that our love was just like that. It wasn't about what we had lost or what we had been through. It was about what we had become together. And that, more than anything, was beautiful. In the quiet of the night, as we lay together, Liam's voice broke the silence. "You never left me," he whispered, his words carrying the weight of everything we had endured. I looked at him, my heart overflowing with love and gratitude. It wasn't just the words that moved me. It was the depth of feeling behind them. He had believed for so long that I might leave, that the pain of his injury would be too much for me to bear. But I hadn't left him. I had stayed, just as I had promised. And now, he was finally seeing that. "Never will," I vowed, my voice steady with conviction. In that moment, I knew that we were stronger than we had ever been. Our love had been tested, but it had never wavered. We had fought through the darkness together, and we were still standing side by side. We weren't just surviving, we were thriving. And as I looked into Liam's eyes, I knew that no matter what came our way, we would face it together. He wasn't alone anymore. Neither of us was. We had made it through the worst, and we had emerged stronger. And that was a promise I would keep for the rest of my life. I used to believe that love was about perfect moments, the kind of moments you see in movies or read about in books. The kind of love that is effortless, without challenges or struggles. But after everything Liam and I had been through, I realized that love is so much more than that. Love isn't just about the good times, the moments of joy and laughter. It's about the hard times too. It's about being there for each other when things seem impossible, when the world feels like it's falling apart. It's about holding on to one another even when it feels like you're losing everything. And I realized that the moments we shared, those moments of vulnerability, of pain, of growth, were just as beautiful as the happy moments. They were the foundation of our love, the bedrock that held us steady when the storms came. Liam and I had been through so much, and yet, we had never given up on each other. We had learned that love isn't about perfection. It's about being there, no matter what. And in that, we had found something truly extraordinary. After all that Liam and I had been through, it was clear that he was different. The man I had known before his deployment, the strong, confident, fearless soldier, had changed. His body had been altered in ways that were impossible to ignore. But despite the physical changes, the core of who he was, his spirit, his heart, remained unchanged. It was something I had known deep down from the moment he returned. Liam had suffered, yes. He had endured unimaginable pain and loss. But he was still my Liam. And no matter how different he looked or how much he struggled, my love for him had never wavered. In fact, it had deepened. Because love isn't just about the surface. It's about the soul, the connection that runs much deeper than appearance. And our connection, though tested by the harshest of circumstances, had only grown stronger. Liam was different, yes, but in some ways, that made our love even more powerful. We had weathered storms together, and we had emerged stronger for it. The love that bound us was unshaken, unbreakable, and unyielding. The word hero is thrown around so casually in today's world. We say it about athletes, celebrities, and even fictional characters. But for me, there was only one person who truly embodied the meaning of that word, Liam. Before he went to war, I never would have thought of him as a hero. He was just my husband, the man I loved. But after everything he had endured, his time in captivity, the loss of his legs, the emotional toll it had taken on him, I saw him in a completely new light. Liam had fought for his life, not just on the battlefield, but every single day after he returned. He fought through pain, through self-doubt, through isolation. And most importantly, he fought for us. He fought to keep our love alive, to rebuild everything we had lost. In my eyes, that made him my hero, not because of the uniform he wore, but because of the strength and courage he showed in the face of the greatest adversity. He had endured the unimaginable, and yet he still stood beside me. That was the true definition of heroism. And every day, I marveled at his strength, his resilience, and his unwavering determination to keep moving forward. Pain and loss are inevitable parts of life. We can't avoid them, no matter how hard we try. But what we can do is choose how we respond to them. And through all the pain and loss Liam and I had experienced, we had found something that was unbreakable: our love. It hadn't been easy. There were days when the weight of everything we had been through felt too heavy to bear. There were days when I wasn't sure if we would make it. But through it all, we held on to each other. And in doing so, we created something that couldn't be shattered by pain or loss. Our love had been tested in ways I never thought possible, but it had come out stronger for it. We had learned to lean on each other, to give each other strength when we had none left. And in that, we had found a love that was unbreakable. It wasn't the kind of love that was built on perfect moments or ideal circumstances. It was a love that had been forged in the fire of adversity, and that made it all the more precious. For a long time, I feared that our story would end in tragedy. I feared that the wounds we carried, physical, emotional, psychological, would be too much to overcome. I feared that Liam would never be the man he once was, and that we would never be able to move past the horrors of war. But as time passed, I began to see our story in a new light. It hadn't ended in tragedy. It had transformed us. Yes, we had been through unimaginable hardship, but we had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more deeply connected than ever before. We had learned to navigate the complexities of our new reality, and we had done it together. Our love had not been broken by tragedy. It had been reshaped, refined, and strengthened. Our journey had been difficult, but it had brought us closer, and it had taught us the true meaning of love, sacrifice, and commitment. We weren't the same people we had been before, but in many ways, that was a good thing. We had grown, evolved, and emerged as a stronger couple, more determined than ever to face the future together. Liam's scars were impossible to ignore. They were visible reminders of everything he had been through, physical reminders of the pain and suffering he had endured. But as I looked at them, I didn't see them as symbols of defeat. I saw them as symbols of strength. Each scar told a story of survival, of resilience, of the courage to keep going even when everything seemed lost. They were part of who Liam was, but they didn't define him. They didn't define our love. The story of our lives was still being written, and his scars were only a small part of it. They weren't the final chapter. They weren't the end of our story. In fact, they were just the beginning. The chapters that followed would be filled with healing, with growth, with new adventures, and with even deeper love. Liam's scars didn't mark the end of our journey. They marked the beginning of a new chapter. And together, we would write that chapter, one filled with hope and possibility. War had taken so much from Liam. It had taken his legs, his sense of self, and in many ways, it had taken pieces of his soul. But as I watched him fight his way through each day, I realized something profound. He was more than what war had taken from him. War could take his body, but it could never take his spirit. It could take away the life he had known, but it could never take away the man he was at his core. Through all the loss and hardship, Liam had remained true to himself. He had found new ways to live, new ways to love, and new ways to dream. His strength didn't lie in his physical abilities. It lay in his resilience, in his heart, in his unwavering determination to rebuild what had been broken. And that was something no war, no injury, no hardship could ever take from him. Liam was more than the sum of his scars. He was more than what had been stolen from him. He was the man who had refused to let life break him. And that made him stronger than anything I could have ever imagined. For a long time, I defined myself by my role in Liam's life. I was the woman who waited, the one who stayed behind while he was at war, the one who held on to hope when everything seemed lost. But as I stood beside him during his recovery, I realized that I was more than just that. I wasn't just the woman who waited. I was a partner, a fighter, a woman who had her own strength and resilience. I had been through my own battles, my own struggles, and I had fought to keep our love alive. And as Liam and I moved forward, I began to see myself in a new light. I wasn't just the person who had supported him. I was an integral part of the journey we were on together. I was the woman who had chosen to love him, to fight for him, and to never give up. And that was something I could be proud of. We had both changed, but we had both grown. And in that growth, we had found a deeper, more powerful connection. I was more than just the woman who waited. I was the woman who loved him, and that was more than enough. Our story had been written in pain, in loss, and in heartache. But as we stood together, hand in hand, I realized that we were writing a new chapter, a chapter of hope. Hope wasn't something that came easily for either of us. After all the darkness we had endured, it would have been easy to let despair take root. But we chose hope. We chose to believe that there was more to life than the pain we had experienced, that there was more to us than the struggles we had faced. Together, we were building a future, brick by brick, moment by moment. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was ours. We had learned that life didn't always give us what we expected, but it gave us what we needed. And what we needed was each other. Together, we had created something beautiful out of the wreckage of our past. We had built a love that was stronger than ever, and we had learned that no matter what life threw at us, we could face it together. And that was all the hope we needed. Life had tested us in ways I could never have imagined. It had taken everything we had, our hopes, our dreams, our peace, and turned it upside down. But through it all, love never let us fall. Love had been the constant, the anchor that kept us grounded when everything else seemed to be crumbling around us. Love was what had kept us fighting, kept us believing, kept us moving forward. When Liam felt like he couldn't go on, I was there to remind him that he wasn't alone. And when I felt like I couldn't bear the weight of it all, he was there to hold me up. Together, we had weathered the storm, and together, we had come out the other side stronger. Love had been our salvation. It had been the light in the darkest of times, the hope when there was none. And as we looked ahead to the future, I knew that no matter what challenges we faced, love would always be there to catch us when we fell. Surviving the impossible is never easy. It takes strength, resilience, and an unwavering belief that no matter how hard life gets, you will make it through. Liam and I had survived the impossible. We had survived the horrors of war, the pain of loss, the trials of recovery, and the darkness of doubt. And we had survived because of one thing, our love. It was a love that had been tested by fire, a love that had been shattered and rebuilt over and over again. But through it all, it never wavered. It only grew stronger. Our story wasn't one of perfection. It wasn't one of happily ever after without struggle, but it was a story of survival, of hope, of perseverance. It was a story of two people who, despite everything that had been taken from them, refused to give up on each other. And in the end, that's how we survived the impossible. Together.